Glad that all of you have stayed and joined us. Tonight we're joined by Congregante Jorge Muñoz-Bustamante here at the Miami House. He's a counselor at Belen, has been so for many years. Been a member here of the Miami chapter as well for many years. We're grateful to have him. Tonight he's going to address 7 principles to great marriages. It is the work of Dr. John Gottman, as you see there on your screen. It's the work that Jorge Muñoz-Bustamante is very familiar with. He's read, he's presented on it. So we're pleased to have him here to give us a run through of this work. So George, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you with one last comment. Anybody with comments or questions, please feel free to post it on the YouTube chat. We're monitoring it. And I'll relay those to George. So George, if you will.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. I don't know how many of you know this, but I've been very interested in marriages ever since I started in graduate school back in the 70s. And I came across the work of John Gottman about 30 years ago. At that time, there was very little information on marriages. The data was very slim and very few things worked with marriages. Therapies were pretty much a disaster. And so he was really the first one to come out with enough data to say, you know, this is what's happening with marriages. This is why they fail. And then as things evolved, he started also identifying what made marriages successful. So basically, he's interviewed now, with the past 30 years, he's interviewed about 3,000 couples. So you have a huge, broad sample to work with over a very long period of time. So by now, you know, we're getting a pretty good idea of what makes marriages work, what makes for a great marriage, and what works for, and what pretty much destroys a marriage. And something else about this too that I just want to point out, that what's got me very excited about this work is that a lot of the stuff you're going to see here works with all kinds of relationships, with your friends, with your sons. So it's not, you know, the focus here is on marriages, but as you're going to be seeing, a lot of the components or the principles you're going to see here are pretty universal. So that's who John Gottman is. He is a professor at the University of Washington who is, his first claim to fame, and this is something that he was initially first known for, was that he could predict divorce within a 3-year period after observing a couple interact for 15 minutes with an accuracy rate of 90%. So think about that for a second. Okay, he could watch a couple interact and basically from just 15 minutes of interaction predict with a 90% accuracy rate as to whether that couple would be divorced in 3 years. Later on, he was able to actually do the same thing and predict which couples would have not just okay marriages, but great marriages. And that's what's exciting about his kind of work. So let me get started with what makes for a bad marriage. What are some of the things that he's identified that make for a bad marriage? Well, there are 4 components. There are 4 behaviors that he sees in marriages that are pretty predictive of divorce. And again, these behaviors happen in great marriages and in bad marriages, but they happen a lot more in the troubled marriages. So the first thing that you see a lot more of by a ratio of 5-to-1 is the ratio of criticism. Criticism is aimed at the person, not at the behavior. So criticism is about something being wrong with you. Not that you're doing something wrong, but that there's something wrong with you. So the ratio of criticism as opposed to complaining and things like that is on troubled marriages is much higher than it is on healthy and very functional marriages. The second component is what he calls contempt, meaning holding someone to be lower than you, to be somewhat less than you. You can hook it up with arrogance if you like. And again, every once in a while you see this in great marriages too, but you see it much more often in marriages that are troubled. And here's what happens when there's a lot of criticism and a lot of contempt, you engage in defensiveness. You start, when someone talks about you and defines you as a person in a negative way, you're going to become very defensive. You're not going to respond to that in any kind of open way. And the same thing if you're being held in contempt by someone who's supposed to love you, well, you're going to become very defensive and protect yourself. And in men, by the way, that leads to what is called stonewalling. So stonewalling is when you're flooded emotionally, and especially this happens more in men than women. Just to get an idea, in troubled marriages, criticism is more the role of the woman, and stonewalling is more the role of the man. Okay, the men tend to clam up. They tend to just sit down, you cross your arms, and you sort of go do this, and then all right, I got 5 more minutes till the football game starts. Okay, I can do this, and then off you go. So as you can see, what is the problem with these patterns? Well, this is where after this happens for a while, you can see where you can see then the end game of the troubled marriage. And the end game is that the marital problems are seen as severe. Joint problem solving is seen as pretty useless. Obviously, if contempt is a big part of the marriage, criticism is a big part of the marriage, um, uh, then it's going to be really hard to trust each other to solve joint problems. And finally, you see them beginning to lead parallel lives. So basically, they're married technically, but they might as well be leading parallel lives. And finally, you see them reconstructing their history. So when you ask a troubled marriage about their history, they'll they don't find much good in it. They won't. It's like, yeah, we met each other, we liked each other, it was okay, but you know, it was always going to be a problem with this. I had a problem with that from the beginning. In other words, the history sort of gets reconstructed. So when they finish telling it, it's like, well, why did they ever get married in the first place? Well, when they did get married, it was probably a different history. But as time has gone on and you have seen the parallel lives, then that history gets reconstructed. And when, of course, you can see how this whole thing ties up, eventually you have loneliness because they're leading very parallel lives and they end up leading very lonely lives. And that's pretty much by that time is when the marriage is done. They may be sharing the same roof, they may be legally married, but chances are the divorce is going to happen pretty soon. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what makes for a trouble marriage and what makes for a marriage to pretty much end. Now, here we go to the fun part. What makes a great marriage? Well, what you're going to be seeing is that the components of a great marriage are pretty much result in the opposite effect of what we just saw. So, the first component of a great marriage is that the spouses know each other very well. They know what's going on in each other's lives. And I'll give you a chance to now take a look at your own relationship and get a feel for where it's at when it comes to this. This is a questionnaire that we use in the workshop. I forgot to tell you, I have been trained both in the Gottman couples therapy method about 20 years ago, and also in the workshop for couples for the 7 principles. Maybe someday we will do one, the Educación. But so this is material from that training. So if you can look at this, he calls this love maps. The love map is basically about how well you know your partner. And if you look at a love map and look at those 20 questions there, just take a look at them and take a moment and scan them and see how many of them ring true. I can name my partner's best friends. I can tell you the stresses my partner is currently facing. Just put yourself on that and take a minute and scan them down. And I'll be right with you as you do that. So as you did that, as you scanned down those 20 items, you were able to pretty much say, yeah, you know what, that happens in our marriage, pretty much. If if not, then you sort of said, nah, you know what, that doesn't happen much. Well, the way that you look at this is if you were able to say true to about 16 of those, your marriage is pretty strong when it comes to knowing each other. It pretty much gives you an idea that you know each other pretty well. If it's a lot less than that, then this is an area that could really use development. And the idea behind this is that there are several exercises that you can do with your spouse, several activities you can do that can actually it can really have a very strong effect on your love map, on how well you know your spouse. And this is important, by the way, because what happens in a lot of the marriages is that they simply neglect each other. The world is very demanding, especially in our lives, of our time, and we don't have time for each other. So basically, we stop losing contact with each other, and eventually, we don't know each other very well. So one of the first components of a great marriage is how familiar you are and how connected you are with your spouse's life. The second one is what he calls the fondness and admiration system. In other words, how well do they like each other? And do they admire each other? Strong couples like being with each other. They just do. They really enjoy each other's company. And they have an incredible admiration for each other. They really admire their spouse. And if you take a second to think about that as the antidote to what we were talking about before. In other words, if you admire someone, it's really hard to be contemptuous of them. If you really know what is going on in that person's life, what her challenges are, what her struggles are, what what's happening, what her tensions are, then it's really hard to be critical of the person. Remember, those are the acids that destroy the marriage. So the way that you counteract is by learning to appreciate, learning to admire, and learning to like your spouse. And again, there's also a way of looking at and see if that's an area of strength in your marriage. This has a lot to do with how fond you are of each other. I'll do the same thing. I'll give you a few moments to take a look at it and run them on down while I take a sip of water. The same as the other, they're either true or false. They either apply to your relationship or does not. And some of them are really great questions. You can see them there. Things like I can easily list the three things I most admire about my partner. I can tell you why I married my partner. I'm really proud of my partner. The things that you can actually have a conversation about. I'm really proud of you because this, because of that. So again, the same thing as before. There are about 20 questions there. And if you answered true to about 16 of them, then you can pretty much say that this is an area of strength in your marriage. If on the other hand, you answered a lot less than those, and I'm not going to give you a hard and fast rule because every marriage is different, but it's something that you want to work on. And the thing about this is that this is something that is very easy to build. This is not rocket science. This is about putting time into it, about having the right information, and about just using the right strategy. So setting some time aside to build this and having the right information available can easily raise this to a much higher level. And this is the only one I'm going to give you a more concrete example of. So here's an activity that you can do with your spouse. One of about three or four that we have that we encourage couples to do. And by the way, a lot of this work is not to work with troubled couples. It is to work with marriages that are solid marriages, but that want to take it up a level, that they really want to make this a lot stronger, a lot more complete as a marriage. So in this exercise, what we would do is we would give each spouse a sheet and we would have them draw a circle about around 5 of the qualities that they admire about their partner. And we would then encourage them to share those findings with their partners in a statement like, I love the fact that you are spontaneous, and then talk about a time in which your partner was spontaneous. Um, I love that you're quick-witted. I remember when you were there and that guy was being critical of you, and man, you came up with a real winner. I really like that about you. That kind of interchange. Again, as you can see, this is just, in many ways, is just paying attention and not neglecting a component of our relationships. So we talked about the love maps and we talked about the admiration systems and the fondness that you have for each other. The next thing about great marriages is that they turn towards each other. Of course, if they know each other well, if they admire each other, they turn towards each other. Affectionately, they turn towards each other for solutions. They trust each other a great deal. They have their back, so to speak. So when what we're talking about here is things like um, your partner interested in hearing your view on things. You really enjoy discussing things with your partner. Again, I'm going to give you the same 20 questions and let you go through them. And as you go through them, decide whether they're true or false in your own relationship and think about them a little bit. We always have a lot to say to each other. When we go out, time goes by quickly. We like doing the same things. Spiritually very compatible. My partner is one of my best friends. And you can see a pattern forming here. If you're working on these strengths, you can see how that's completely the opposite of what destroys marriages. You're moving it in the other direction. It's what St. Ignatius would call aje de contra. You're going in the exact opposite direction. Okay. And again, in the workshop and in the book, oh, I didn't say that. So Gottman became famous in 2011 because he wrote a book called The Seven Principles for Making Marriage Work. The book became a bestseller, and then he formed a workshop around it. And a lot of this comes from that book. And I think the book's about $12. You can pick it up, and all this stuff and the activities are contained in that book. Well, I'll talk to you about more about that later. Now to go back to this, the same thing as the other ones. If you answer about 16 of them true, then you know this is an area of a lot of strength in our marriage. On the other hand, if you only answered a few of them as being true, then it's an area that would really benefit from some time invested on it. And like I said, there are activities to do this, but I'm not going to go into those, just the one I showed you before. And the next component of a great marriage is to accept influence from each other. That's a huge one. So in great marriages, spouses allow each other to be influenced by them. They really take their partner's opinions very, very, very seriously. If you're going to make a decision about something, you really value your partner's input into it. And I'll give you an example of what that means. You can see it right here. This is very well laid out here. If you take a look at these, this is what I mean by accepting influence from your partner. And many couples do not do this. They simply they don't have that that desire to allow the other one to influence them. So again, take a look at it and see if that's an area of strength for you. You know, in the old marriages, the machista marriages, the man had all the answers and you never listen to the woman, that kind of stuff. Well, that creates the loneliness that we're talking about earlier on. So again, a very sign of strength is accepting influence from your spouse. And take a look at them. There are 20 of them. If you can answer true to 16 of them, then it is an area of strength in your marriage. And if you're saying to yourself, you know, man, this is not me, then you know what? You might want to take a look and see how you can make that a stronger part of your marriage. And you can see, again, I reiterate this because it's so important. You remember what we talked about, what makes for a lousy marriage? Well, you can see how this has the opposite effect. It's not the same thing. It's goes in the opposite direction. The next one is that great marriages are very good at solving solvable problems. They're very effective at it. Now, his research shows that there are two kinds of problems in a marriage: those that have a solution and those that don't. And the ratio of problems that have a solution to those that don't is about 30 to 70. So basically 70% of marital problems don't have a solution. They're going to be that way 20 years from now. So if you go and record these couples, and he's done this now with about 3,000 of them, and he's kept in touch with most of them. So if you re-record them 20 years later, the problems are still the same that they were 20 years ago. You know, you're sloppy, you don't leave your things in place, you're too this. So what couples that have great marriages do is that they're very good at solving solvable problems, and they're also very good at adapting to the unsolvable problems. They're really good at being able to have a conversation about them and at simply living with them. And they stop demanding that the problem be resolved. They simply work on it. They talk about it, they can complain about it, but they're able to more or less just live with it because there's so much more to the marriage. Again, I go back to how you're building up all this now, right? So if you admire someone, if you know that person well, if you're very fond of that person, then it's easier to put up with that person's irritating habits or whatever it is that you're dealing with. So again, how effective are you as a couple at solving problems? Well, here's a chance to find out. Like I said, this is very well put together. So here's 20 questions that have to do with that. And these go in the opposite. So in this one, if 4 or more are true, then it's an area that needs improvement. You can see why, right? I seem to always get blamed for issues. I feel I have to ward off personal attacks. My partner's feelings are too easily hurt. If all these things, if 4 or 5 of these things are happening in your marriage, then it's something that needs improvement. That needs to work on. But if it's not, then it's a strength of your marriage. Just take a look at them and ask yourselves whether this is something that's true or false, and take it from there. And then the other one was the couple's ability to deal with gridlocked issues. In other words, problems that they're stuck with, that are a strong part of the marriage that we just talked about. So in that one, again, you can take a look at it and see what we're talking about here. If 4 more of these are true, then this is an area that needs improvement. Otherwise, it's a strength of the marriage. As in the other components of a marriage, the same thing applies. There are a lot of activities that you can do to move this in the opposite direction. Like I said, it's a skill. You're not born this way. This is something that you've learned. And if you can learn something, you can unlearn it. So, and a skill is about 3 things. I said it again, and I'll keep on saying it throughout this conversation. It's about putting time into it. It's about having the right strategy, and it's about having the right teacher or the right information. That's how you acquire any skill, whether it is having a great relationship or whether it is playing tennis. It's the same thing. It's about putting time into it, about finding the right strategy, and about having the right teacher or the right information in front of you. And the last one is what we call creating shared meaning. And this is the highlight. This is something that is a huge part of great marriages. Their ability to create shared meanings. And now you can see how all of this ties together. So if you know your spouse well, if you're very fond of each other, if you really admire each other, if you are able to turn towards each other and have each other's back, if you accept influence from each other, if you are effective at solving the problems that can be solved, and you're able to overcome the gridlocked issues, then you can see how easy it is to create shared meaning. See, the whole thing is a process. Nothing stands on its own. It's a circular process, and one thing leads to the other. That's why this is such a great strategy to build a great marriage. Here are some of the things that are typical of a marriage in which there's a lot shared meaning. It's a much longer questionnaire, but I just gave you a small part of it. So you can see how if you share a lot of these, that can easily make for a great marriage. So here are the 7 principles, okay, in a nutshell. All right. And here's some resources for you. The first one is the book. The second one is these card decks are about love maps. So they're little cards so you can work on the love maps using an app, a Gottman app. Then there is a podcast, which is very good. And then you have and then there's a YouTube talk in which Gottman is on that really goes over this very well. To sum it up, great marriages don't happen by accident. Great marriages have to do with learnable skills or with learned skills. And skill acquisition happens with time on task, strategy, and good information or mentoring. And with enough time on task, the right strategy, and the right information, many marriages can be great marriages, and many relationships can be very, very great relationships. Thank you very much. And that's pretty much all she wrote. Questions?
George. Thank you, George. I think if you want to unshare your screen now so that those that still watch can just see us talking.
Okay.
And then that way, if it'll be a little easier to have the conversation in that sense. So I thought that material is excellent, really good material. And as I was going through it, it's almost, I have quite a few comments, but I might jump back and forth. The one that strikes, and you can almost do that individually on your own and sort of work individually on yourself and what you see. The one that stood out for me is stonewalling. I do that all the time, and my wife's aware of it, and I'm aware of it, thank God. And when it comes up, I have to realize, man, I'm stonewalling, and I have to be conscious of it and say, stop stonewalling, you ignorant man, and to work on that. But as I go through some of these, this is just excellent. Like I said, go through it individually, and you can really work on it yourself. Again, but also as a couple. But what great material! And another thought that came to my mind, that the very first thing, how men stonewall and women tend to be critical. In our culture, where we're trying to break down these stereotypes, if you will, these gender markers, but that is just so universally true.
Oh yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And it has to do with the way that men process emotions and the way that women process emotion. That's pretty universal. Right. It's changing a little bit, but what happens with stonewalling is what's called flooding. Basically, men emotionally, when men get emotionally upset, they shut down most of the time until they blow up.
Yeah.
Women tend to process. So when the answer to stonewalling is really not to do it, but instead of doing it, understanding what's happening and taking time out. What that means is that your blood pressure is going up. What that means is that your adrenaline is beginning to come up. Mm-hmm. And what needs to happen is if you would be wearing a monitor, and when I used to do couples therapy, they would wear monitors. That means that your heartbeats are up to about 110, 120, and you need to bring them back down to 80 again. So you take time out. What I used to do with the couples is I would say, "Oh, wait a minute, I got a problem now. Could you stop? If you just stop arguing for a second, I'll be right back." And then I would step out, and then by the time pick it up when we got back in. So, but you're totally correct. The book is excellent for that. The book
Yeah.
is fantastic because it really does walk you through the whole process. It gives you all the activities, and it really goes into I gave you a very brief summary of an 8-hour presentation. So I mean, this is like really, really, really condensed.
Right. Right. And I'm going to go to a YouTube question here, but what this idea that great marriages don't happen by accident. I think in our society we see couples getting married later in life.
Hmm.
And when I talk to younger people, they're always waiting to find that perfect person,
Yeah.
thinking that if I find the perfect person, I'm going to enter marriage and it's just going to be bliss from the beginning to end. And
Right.
it's a fallacy.
It's completely because they don't realize that it looks natural, but it really is not. It's the product of how you were raised. It's a product of the skills you have acquired.
Yeah.
And and again, we may not have acquired those skills, but we can. There's nothing that we may have acquired skills that aren't helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I really believe that if you learned it, you can unlearn it, and if you haven't learned it, you can learn it.
But unlearning it goes to that you talked about solving problems and that ability to change. That's another comment I had here too. Is some of the things that I hear from even couples that are married. You have to accept me the way I am. I'm not going to change.
Yeah,
And if you can't accept me the way I am, then well, we got to do something else.
yeah, yeah, and that kind of process can be two things. Okay, there is a legitimate thing in which what I'm never going to be the most orderly person in the world. It's just not going to happen. You know, it can be that, and then we can have a conversation about it. Or it can be something else. It can be
Mm-hmm.
a lack of not knowing me, of not admiring me, of not knowing anything about me, of not understanding the bigger dimension of myself.
Right.
So if a human being is a giant pizza with 20 slices, one slice of that pizza might be that I'm messy, but you probably may not know the rest of the pizza, and vice versa, of course. So the idea behind those things is, yeah, there are things about me that are just simply not going to change all that much, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not aggressive. It's, let's have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
And then, if you really like the person, if you admire the person, then that just becomes, it becomes an irritant, but it doesn't become the person.
And yeah, I want to follow up on that, but real quick, can you stop sharing your screen so that I don't think you have done that yet. If you hit
No.
stop share. But when I read through some of these things, and when I read through some of those questionnaires, there is a call to change.
Oh, yeah.
There is a call to change. If you are stonewalling, you have to change.
Yeah.
If you're hypercritical, you have to change. If you don't converse with your wife on a regular basis, there's a call to change.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the difference. In other words, in the great marriages, you see that happening. And that's why each one of those principles has activities assigned to it. So
Yeah.
you can acquire that skill. In other words, being able to knowing somebody well is a skill.
Mm-hmm.
Being able, and the thing is that if you know someone well and you admire that person a lot, then you're not critical of that person. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
You know,
it does. You're accepting of that person. You're not critical. But what if they're? I still see that if you're going through this questionnaire, and if you're doing individual or as a couple, there's an aspect of certain things that you may have to change about yourself.
of course, yeah, yeah, but then you're going to want to,
Yes, that's it.
which is the big
Yeah,
difference. Then you're going to want to, and it's going to
yeah,
happen naturally as I get to know you better, as I get to know more about your struggles, about your values, as I get to know you more, as I stay in touch with your world. I mean, he talks about one of his, and I've had these before too, but he talks about a client that didn't know the name of the family dog.
Mm.
you know, you know, that's pretty,
Tuned out. That's tuned
that's
out
pretty
right
tuned
there.
out, and I mean, when you it's like when you get to know someone well and you really get to admire that person, you can trust
Yeah.
that person has your back, you accept influence from that person, then it's much easier to not be critical of that person.
To break down the walls. That reminds me of the movie As Good as It Gets with there's Jack Nicholson's that stubborn old man he meets. I think it's Helen Hunt,
Uh-huh.
and he ultimately decides to change. He has to change some of his habits
Yeah.
because he wants to, because he
Exactly.
wants to please the Helen Hunt's character.
Yeah, think about your best friend. Think about Father Llorente. You admire Father Llorente so much that how would you criticize Father Llorente?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we all admired him. So to the point in which it'd be hard for us to say something hurtful or something critical to him about
Right.
him. We
Right.
could, but we wouldn't.
Right. Yeah. You want to have that relationship with that person
Because of how much you admire him, how much he had your back. Again, if you look at Father Llorente, you have the epitome of that. He knew your world. He knew what you were doing. He was extremely fond of you. He was very admiring of whoever walked in through the door. I mean, he was able to always find those things about people, and that's what made it such a great relationship.
And those deep relationships are what we want. Each
Yeah.
individual strives for those deep relationships, and our marriages, I think, in our current society, tremendously lack the deep connection between the spouses.
Absolutely.
And and this goes to another point I wanted to bring up. Sometimes in our secular world, marriage is about me being good enough to you and you being good enough to me, where we work like in a social contract. It's almost like we do business together. We happen to do business together very well, and we will do business together as long as it works. But there's never a deeper penetration
Right.
of the person.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And you brought that up a little bit with that machismo culture, or in our current society, individualism. As long as you are good for me, we'll stay together.
Right.
If there's this no give and take, which your presentation and that book invites us to, this to and fro, this back and forth relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. And accepting influence is one of the marks of a great marriage. People that accept influence from each other score very high in satisfaction scales in a marriage.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to get to, is that we're talking about not just an idea, but about when I give a couple a satisfaction questionnaire. Okay, the ones that score very high on that questionnaire are the ones that show those components. They have, when you ask, well, what makes this marriage score so high on the satisfaction scale, that's what you find.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not an idea. This is something that has been shown time and time and time again.
It's concrete.
Yeah.
One other point, which I thought very interesting, that what's bad for marriages is when you start reconstructing your history.
Yeah.
And then what's good for marriage is that you have created shared meaning. I'm curious. I think, or what's your opinion on certain couples who fall into marriage for different reasons? For instance, let's say a pregnancy causes folks to get married.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a point in your marriage where it might be healthy to reconstruct your history?
Oh, yeah, I hear what you're talking about. But here's the thing, okay? It's not about where marriage starts. It's about where it ends.
Mm.
And my thinking on it is that no matter where it starts, a lot of marriages can have great endings. To me, that's because, again, I think that all of these components, now that we know what makes for a great marriage, all those skills are very learnable.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's say that your marriage didn't get off in the right foot. okay, because it was a marriage under pressure or whatever. That in itself is just the beginning. But the history of the marriage is not where it started. The history of the marriage is what happened after you met and all that stuff. And if you were going to meet again, and I'm looking at a circumstance in which maybe someone got pregnant and they were forced to each other, but even then, there's probably a history in that marriage in which at one point they liked each other.
Yeah.
That's why she got pregnant. It didn't happen, I mean, and they really did have a lot going for each other. And so, and then once this happens, then the outcome is about, well, how do they relate to each other moving forward?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you fall if they become critical, contemptuous, if they stonewall, if they get into loneliness, if they develop parallel lives, then yeah, they might as well be divorced.
Right.
But how can you possibly tell from now to then, as to whether these things are going to be learned or not? He can tell you that. He can look at that couple and look at him in 15 minutes and say, yeah, these people are going to be divorced 90% sure in about 3 years.
But in a sense that it's inevitable, or in the sense that we can save that divorce, we can save that marriage?
So the research is that basically what he does is he has trained observers, and they look for these qualities that we talked about, the negative qualities, and then they score them, pop, pop, pop,
Mm-hmm.
pop, pop, and then with just about 15 minutes of observations, you can see all these things pop up in the frequency. So if they're not tended to, okay, then yes, in 3 years, there's a 90% chance that they will be divorced.
Okay.
Now, what happens after therapy? What happens after intervention? That's a whole different process. And what I was alluding to originally was that when I started in the field, it was horrible. Therapy was a disaster. Now, with knowing what they do, a lot of these guys can do a lot better work than they used to way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, it was like pretty much, it was a way of really, how do we get divorced? That's why people would come to therapy back then. Now I think you're seeing a lot more work, and I don't know what the data is now, but it's a lot better than it used to be.
Yeah. Two other questions here. One is a little bit more substantive. Asking, where is there a religious or faith component to Gottman's work?
That's a great question. It doesn't have one per se, but of course it can have one. Shared meaning is Ignatian.
Yeah, yeah, right.
The reason why
the human person, at the end of the day, the human person, in the image and likeness of God. This is where how we were created.
And I mean, I just, again, Fray Llorente comes to mind again. Part of the reason why we had a great relationship with Fray Llorente is because we had shared meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's of course it fits right in. It doesn't apply to any particular religion. You can be a person and not have faith and still have a great marriage. But
yeah.
I mean, there's no, a lot of people do.
And that's the positive aspect of it, is that the marriage is healthy.
Yeah.
That's the positive aspect. And the religion brings also to mind this restructuring your history. So, say you have a couple, not a couple of faith, and happen to get married, maybe they're a little older and they decide to settle. This is another big point too. Some couples that I speak to, or some individuals who are not yet married, say, well, I just don't want to settle with anybody. I just want to settle for that person. But if you enter this marriage and you said, like you said, doesn't start off right away, maybe it's not a faithful couple, but maybe there's an aspect of restructuring that history to find those aspects of faith, to find those aspects of Christ working in your marriage that you weren't attuned to years back.
Because then that will reshape your history in a more lovable way.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps you appreciate each other. What happens is that when you rewrite the history, it really confirms how lonely. It's a way of justifying how lonely you are.
Yeah.
or how bad things are. It's really hard to say this really stinks, and but it has such a wonderful history. And what you do in his couples therapy method is one of the most important things is when you interview the couples is talk about their history. And you're trying to fish for a history in which they had a lot of these things going. And if you can find some of that, a little bit few embers there, then then you can work with it.
You can start to flame.
You can stir it up a little bit. You can try to have them focus. Because keep in mind something, okay? Emotions are all about perception. Emotions are not about events. They're about our perceptions of them.
Okay.
How we feel about something, how angry we are about something has a lot to do with our perception of the event. And if we're angry with someone and we want to stay angry with that person, then we come up with a history that fits that feeling.
Right.
It's like when people, anger, I use that because anger is one of the difficult emotions to manage. But yeah, you're right. The history is both a cause, but more than likely it's a symptom of something that's going down in the wrong way.
Another question here is for you to elaborate on if there's such a thing as the 7-year itch.
Excellent question. Let me answer that question more specifically. There's actually a 6-year itch and a 15-year itch. Okay. And here's what I mean by that. So divorces spike at 6 years and at 15 years. That's when they end. Now, with marriages getting older than before, you're going to be seeing another spike with the older marriages. But traditionally, marriages spike at 6 and 15 years. So the 6-year spike happens when the conflict is still very active, in which they're going at each other. They can only take it for about 6 years, and then they blow. The 15-year marriages are more the lonely marriages. What's happened then is that the kids are grown, they're ready to go, and it's like, why are we here? And those are not so much those angry marriages, but they're more like why are we here?
We've led parallel lives, and now we have no more reason to be together.
Yeah. So those are the two spikes. The first one at 6 years, and the second one in 15. And by the way, at the 6 years, that's when all those gridlocked issues develop that cannot be, and then they have a hard time resolving them. So it's a great question. Yeah. But that's what the 7-year itch, how I define it.
I think the last takeaway I get from this book is that we mentioned earlier that deep desire, that desire for deep relationship, the passion that is proper for a marriage and is good within a marriage. I don't get this too often, but sometimes when I speak to others and we talk a little bit about Catholic marriages or reflect on Catholic marriages, there's this bit of an understanding that it's cold, that it's a cold marriage, where we're prudes and we can't be near each other and things of that nature. There's no, we're very isolated. But to the opposite, to the exact, marriage is about having that passion for the other person.
Yeah.
That desire to a deep penetration of the other person.
Yep.
And I think that's what I saw in all these questions.
Yeah.
Was like, and you mentioned also think about your best friend. I think sometimes, in particular for men, we care more to develop our relationship with our best friend, the happy hour, the football, we want to be there. We want to know him better than we want to know our spouse.
Yeah. Yeah. And just, you're right. And just so you know, the big level of dissatisfaction in that marriage, what tends to precipitate that is childbirth.
What do you mean?
Yeah. So the most marriages, see when the child is born, shortly afterwards, there's a very high spike in dissatisfaction.
Dissatisfaction?
Yep.
Why? Why is that?
Because two things happen. One, women get a lot of PPD, postpartum depression, that can handle a long time. And a lot of times they don't handle the connection between the mother and the baby very well. Men don't.
Mm. Do they feel like it's an intrusion?
Yes. What happens is that men sort of feel left out. And that's where you see a lot of spiking in dissatisfaction. Not necessarily in it's going to stay forever, but you see a lot of it there.
But is that dissatisfaction or that failure to connect? I almost feel like that is sort of or if you will, a result of something that was already missing. That the men and the couple didn't already have that connection.
So what you see is that they may have had a very good connection before the baby's born. But when that happens, don't forget, before the baby's born, they're everything to each other. So now the baby's born, and what happens, not in all marriages, but in many marriages, is that when the baby's born, the mother gets more absorbed with the baby than the father does. And then the father sort of gets left out.
Right.
And that's where that disconnect begins to happen. That's where that love map begins to get a little bit cloudy. I'm bringing that up only because the question was asked in terms of when it starts. So that's one of the things that's a cause. But even so, I do think that many times all these things get resolved by practicing these 7 components. And they work, and you can very much work on them. The beauty of this process is, Eric, that there are skills that can be acquired.
Right.
That's what makes me so optimistic about it, is that this is not magic, and it's not rocket science. It's simply a matter of putting time into it, finding the time to do it, strategize, and get the right information.
Yeah.
And you're good to go.
Yeah. Very good. So last question here is a practical one. Somebody wants to know whether you are going to be giving this to the Belen couples. Is that still going forward?
So I last summer, I went to Nashville and I did a training for the 7 Principles workshop for couples. And a group that was familiar with was going to do the Belen this year, but it was canceled by the COVID thing. I like doing it. I wasn't planning on doing it. I'm doing it now with my parents, with the Belen parents, by sending them out weekly segments on this stuff. And I'm giving them a chance to take a look at the material and so forth. But I don't have any plans to do it right now, maybe next year sometime. But it is a very powerful thing. And part of it is that I really do think that a lot of it can be done with just reading the book. And
I think with the Kana groups here, and hopefully anybody watching that is in a Kana group at the Yaku, this is something that Kana group could go through.
Yeah, I mean, and in that sense, I would be more than happy to help a group develop it. I mean, I'm not that, that would be a way of doing it too. Or if anybody wants to do a workshop in the Educación, yeah, I'd be happy to help with that or do that. I'm certified to do it, but it's just one of those things you simply need to put some time into it.
Yeah, that's one of the comments here on YouTube as well, as how the couple has to work at it. Yeah, you have to commit to it.
But what's sad is that you're talking about maybe 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. I mean, it's not rocket science.
But I think those that have that initial hurdle of not wanting to change, they perceive it in their mind as though this is going to take up all my time and this is going to create a big problem. But you're right. It's 10 minutes. It's simple. 10 minutes a day.
Yeah.
A piece
10,
of
15 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of this whole process. And, it's also a matter too of understanding that this stuff, you're looking at 10, 15 minutes a day over a longer period of time. But eventually a lot of this stuff becomes pretty automatic too.
Yeah.
Just like criticism is automatic, just like contempt's automatic, well, admiration becomes automatic too.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, it's just the basic change in how you remember. Again, it's all about perception. I mean, it really is.
All right, George. Well, excellent. I thought this was really good. I myself really enjoyed the presentation and looking through those questions and conversing with you back and forth. I know based on the questions I received, the audience really enjoyed it. So thanks again, George,
It was a
very
lot of
much.
fun. Anytime, guys. Take
Thank
care.
you. All right, and to all those that are watching, thank you for joining us. Please follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you like what you hear, you'll be notified of anything that we post. Look through our videos. We got our masses, the homilies from Father Science, previous presentations, all on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe. And otherwise, we'll be back next Wednesday with our Mass at 8 p.m. Thanks again. Take care. God bless.
See you guys. Take care now. Bye-bye.